Might
So,
skip it that
welcome back. I'm going to keep Karen's slot to half an hour and then half an hour from Michelle to wrap the day up. So, Karen is a great friend of IIMS. Many of you will have met her many times. A non-practicing lawyer, which I always have to say she's a non-practicing. She always caveats everything anyway. So, this is the presentation that Karen put together for large shop and small craft working group when they were out in Parma. And we thought it was incredibly relevant. We thought it was a very good one to do the conference. So, without further ado, Karen,
Thank you, Mike. Thank you. Yes, I'm going to cut it down today because we're now running a little short of time. So some of the points I'm going to unfortunately go through a bit quickly. If you want to talk to me, if you want to talk to me later on this evening, feel free to, and I'll be able to expand on some of them a bit more if you need to actually if you need to speak to me. So there we are. Oh, we've moved on already. Thank you. Okay, insurance contracts and why do you need them? I'm going to go back to basics, which really, I think, covers some of the points that have been made by other speakers today, is making sure you start with the basics. The biggest mistake made by lawyers, my husband was operations manager of the Solicitors Indemnity Fund, and the biggest mistake made by lawyers and a lot of experts is not starting at the beginning. And before I go through and explain, one of the lovely training sessions I had years ago when I worked for an insurance company where I started, the Iron Trades, we had to learn about what was called the garden gate. And it's a fascinating training tool because what you do is you have to write down for somebody how to actually build a garden gate. And you're given the bits diagrammatically and you have to then write down, and then you have to give it to the other person who's working with you. And everybody forgot to tell somebody to pick up the nail to start it, and that is the whole point, is making sure you start at the beginning. And that's the same for when you're doing anything, including your contracts, or when you're thinking about what you require in insurance. So if you ever get a chance to have a look at it, it's very, very simple, and you can always do it as a game at home, but it really makes you think about where you start with your work and everything that you do, your report writing, absolutely, perhaps most of the things in life. So anyway, insurance and contracts, probably like law generally, and accountants, is probably not the most favourable of things to do as an occupation, and people don't really enjoy looking at their contracts or insurance at all. And I can understand, because most of it is written in such a fashion that I still think it's very difficult for people to understand what is actually covered, either in the contract or alternatively in the insurance contract. So anyway, I'm going to just go through and explain some of the reasons for making sure you do, at least at some time during your year, take a look at your contract and the insurances that you have, and always keep your insurances in mind when you're undertaking work. So, so contracts can be obviously written or verbal. I always say don't rely on a verbal contract. If you are going to agree something, put it in writing afterwards. What I do as a lawyer and in our insurance industry, which is a requirement, if we speak to somebody, we then make a note, or we immediately, which I always do, is write to them to confirm a conversation, because then you've got contemporaneous evidence, okay, of what you're talking about. But the best thing to do is to always have a contract written. Even if you've only got the basics down, it's better than nothing, because people do forget what's been agreed, and people misinterpret what's been agreed as well. And if there is a mistake at an early stage, it's better that you find out within the first day or so, because then you may be able to rectify it in an amicable fashion. So the contracts, regulate the actual relationship, the scope of work. And when I talk about the actual nail, I'm talking about starting with the instructions, which again goes back to the expert as well that's been discussed. Always start with your instructions and write them out clearly, okay, as to what's expected from you. So this really just explains in a summary as to what a written contract provides. it obviously provides certainty to those involved parties, and it holds much more weight. If you go to court, at least you've got something in writing to suggest what the obligations of one party is going to be and the obligation of the other party. In general terms, which most people feel aggrieved when they think the other party is not undertaking their obligations. They feel that they may be, double-crossed or violated. So, and don't forget that documents, that contract, we'll call it an agreement. Contract, people always think of a contract as one document. You can form a contract out of many documents, and people don't realise they've formed a contract sometimes. And the other important thing, which I'm going to stress throughout the whole of this, which is quite common, what I see with surveyors is they have one document which sets out perhaps the scope, because I'll head it up. In insurance, we call them schedules. If you see your schedule of insurance, they are all the variables. So in the schedules, they keep the variables. Often people head up scope of work. That is the variable side normally. And they forget to link that document by normally a sentence to say that it relates to their main terms and conditions, and vice versa. So always make sure, if you're going to use, which most people will do, is a letter, for example, of your instruction or whatever, make sure it's linked to your other terms and conditions. Okay, when I say linked, it states, both of them do clearly. If you read your policy wording, it's a very good example of how they do it. It says quite clearly in the policy that the policy is modified by the schedule or the endorsements. And that's, again, you should refer to them in both to make it quite clear. And otherwise, you may find that you go to court and it may be a problem in the courts considering one of the documents that you want to rely on. So that is one of the biggest mistakes. It's called incorporating the terms and conditions. So I tend to say, if you want to vary things, keep it in a formal schedule, your scope of works, which is equivalent to the insurance side for the variables. So verbal contracts, you can form them just by a handshake. But as I say, it's really, really good to make sure it's clear that you've jotted it down. So we're talking about expectations of parties. This is where it all goes wrong. That's why it's very clear. It's very, very good if you're clear when you actually scope your work out, and tell them also what you're not going to do. Okay, so that you're controlling the expectations, because this is the biggest problem. And Paul and others here will know that when it comes to claims, they'll say, well, I expected him to do this. I expected him to do that. So make it clear right at the beginning that you're not going into somewhere that you can't get into. And make it clear also, which I'm not going to go into here, your report. Again, re-emphasize it, but don't use your report to form your terms and conditions. Your terms and conditions must be accepted at the beginning of the contract, okay, because it must form the contract. You can't agree and then say, oh, here we are, here's my terms and conditions. You have to say, my work is subject to my terms and conditions, a copy is here, or link it to your website or whatever. What a lot of people do now, you'll notice it, and you can use the signature part of Outlook, and you can actually put your disclaimer in there, and you can say, which catches many commercial people out, all our work is undertaken subject to our terms and conditions, with the link. And that is the way a lot of experts do it now. So it's really worth doing that. And considering, if you look at my emails, you'll see I've got my disclaimer, that's in my automatic signature box. It goes on, and then you can refer to anything. So the contract, as I said, does specify what people actually want out of the relationship. And think about the contract. Don't just rush into it. Just take time to jot down some notes first, and just make sure you're quite clear as to even what you're putting, what the schedule's going to be, and to make sure that it's quite clear to your client. Perhaps you can speak to them just before you do the work to make sure they understand what will not be covered. And then you're less likely to have a problem when it comes to them reading the report. So contracts should be there to ease your understanding of the law. The legal system is quite complex because of the cases that have been passed by the courts. And unless you specialise in a particular area, you're not going to know how a court is going to interpret what you've produced. But hopefully a contract will help clarify points. And it's important that if you are using a legal advisor, and I know it's very expensive, if you can afford it, I would always recommend it as a consideration. But always make sure you actually understand. Don't ever walk away and thinking, oh, I wonder what he really meant by that. And don't sign anything that you're not sure about. And don't make assumptions. The one thing we're taught in law immediately is never make an assumption. And that should be same with the insurance industry. You don't assume, you always confirm with your client whatever you're doing. Don't make assumptions. So I would say a written contract is the best way to go forward, even if it's just a heads of agreement before finalising a contract. So contracts are there to protect your property. They form really a part of your risk management. I have spoken before about risk management on various talks, but your contract is there to contain your risk, as well as making sure that everybody fulfills their obligations. So the contract, like insurance, forms a part of your whole risk management. And people don't think about risk management because they think, oh, I'm only small, I don't need to think about it. But at the end of the day, most of us have assets, etc. And if anything goes desperately wrong, and I'm not being negative here, but at the end of the day, if anything goes desperately wrong, particularly when death and injury is involved, the chances are they're not going to care about whether you lose all of your assets. So the court's going to be concerned about the injured party. So you must be aware of that. That's why you must consider what you need to do to at least try and contain the risk that we are in industry. And it doesn't matter where you work or what you do as a profession, same as myself, I have to consider what my risk is. But you can't cover every aspect, so you shouldn't worry about it. You're doing the best that you can at that time. So as I say, contracts are not foolproof, so they should be, as I said, part of the risk management is obviously first analysing your risk, which I'm not going to go through here, but forming a good contract and also your report flowing from that contract. And don't digress in the report into an area that you didn't decide that was going to be within your scope. The number of times I've seen valuations done when they shouldn't have been given valuations because the scope never actually said they were going to. Then the judge has got to decide, was it an intention to do it? Was it not an intention? And sometimes they'll find an interpretation that suits them. So you can find yourself in trouble. Contractual terms can be broken. I won't go through all of these. I was going to go through a bit more detail, but you can look at the consumer law, the unfair contracts. Countries have different areas on consumer law and also what's acceptable. One thing I haven't put down, just also make sure that you take a look at what what language should be used in your contract, which may affect some people here. And I did go through and talking, there is a Spanish seminar that I did, and you might want to take a look at that. It's in more detail. Now, in the UK, and I know in other European countries, there are a form of implied terms. And obviously, one of the ones is that you're going to undertake work with reasonable care and skill. Okay, that will always be something which will be there. But there are other implied terms that the courts will find. And you should really just have a read and just understand what they will imply, whether you've put it into your contract or not, unless you specifically exclude it, which is quite difficult for a consumer contract. But if you're doing, obviously, commercial contracts and you're of equal stance, or although the courts tend to find most people of equal stance now, then they will imply terms. So these are just a list of the clauses that you should consider. They're just some of them, they're not all of them. I always say, wherever you're actually undertaking work, have a read of a number of different people's contracts. Have a look at the headings and put them down, see if they've duplicated. The main ones that I tend to use, I always make sure there is a scope, whatever you want to call it, for what's being done. Sometimes that's a binding, and sometimes it's it wouldn't be a binding clause, depending on what else you're actually using to form the contract. But I still think it's good to set it out as to what you're doing in the contract or in the schedule if it's going to be variable. For example, with surveyors, you're going to be doing different types of work, so it's probably going to go into the schedule. And I include clauses that are probably there to be broken. If you ever read contracts, you know that some of them are going to be challenged. But it's always worth putting them in, even though you know you may not be able to persuade a judge that they're going to apply it. So just make sure it's clear the obligations to a client. I use very clear headings because I like bullet points. One of the reasons is because my background was originally in science, and when I had to do report writing, which is very interesting listening to the expert report writing, we were told to always summarise, and the content had to support the conclusion and the opinions, and our opinions could only come from facts. So I'm very used to making sure that everything flows, and also that needs to be the same with your contracts as well. Put your headings in, you know, surveyor's obligations, client's obligations. You might want the client, let's say, to provide certain documents, and then you might want to state there that if they're provided on, you know, you'll take reasonable reliance on them. Things like that is what you're actually, you know, you actually want in terms of obligations, what you expect. The general things like payment terms, time restriction clauses, perhaps on your work, perhaps on their payments, perhaps on when you can do the job. Always make sure there's a third-party exclusion to make sure that third parties can't actually rely on the documents, on the contract. Are you allowed to subcontract the work? It's not necessarily automatic. Should you put it in there? What happens if you become ill and you need to get a friend to do it? Are you making it personal? Different if it's a limited company normally, but then do you want to subcontract to somebody else under their name, or are you going to bring them under your umbrella? And also on that, which you'll notice, make sure the insurance companies also know whether you're subcontracting. Indemnities, who would you want an indemnity from? Would you want an indemnity from your client for something that they do? Misleading is something which you might consider. It's quite difficult, obviously, to always prove. It's a bit like fraud, etc. But there may be certain circumstances where you want an indemnity from somebody, or perhaps if a broker's instructed you to do something, or another party. Termination is interesting because if you don't have a right to terminate and then suddenly you don't like and don't want to do the job, and then you terminate and somebody has a loss, they could sue you for breach of contract. Now, some people have backed away and just returned the money to people, but that doesn't mean that may not be sufficient. Somebody may say, well, you've returned my money that I paid you to do the job, but I'm out X, Y, and Z as a result of you. And so always make sure that I think you should have a termination clause in there. And again, take a look at what you feel happy with. Entire contract clauses, these can also be broken, although it may say that certain documents or one document is the entire contract. You can end up varying that depending on what you do as your actions, as well as what your written is. Don't forget that actions can speak as loud as what I call words and written words. So if you do something, and particularly if you're using standard terms and conditions, a court can decide, well, actually, you've decided to vary them. And it's not uncommon, that's when it's to the benefit of the client. So always be careful of your actions as much as what you write. Okay. A force majeure is probably obvious. It's things outside your control. And I would always make sure, but always remember to consider there's various different headings of force majeure. I can go into more detail. It's not just necessary volcanic action and whatever else is going on. Don't forget about political. You may want something, for example, your own illness. You might want to put under there as a heading of force majeure if you're ill and you're not able to do it. There are many headings and many phraseologies for force majeure. It's not just your standard one for incidents, for example, which we use in the insurance industry. And don't forget your jurisdiction. I always have my jurisdiction separate from my law and practice clause, just in case a judge decides to strike out one or the other. Because people don't always know whether, in some circumstances, it's different if you're dealing purely with commercial, but when you're dealing with very large yachts, are you dealing with somebody who's a consumer? Are they buying it for the purposes? Have they told you that? Or are they buying it on a business basis? Are they chartering it and therefore technically a business basis? So you don't always know, and you're relying on your client to advise you what his status is in law. Is he actually a commercial person, or is he an individual buying? And it's quite important in certain countries that you are quite clear on who you're dealing with as to how the contract's going to be viewed and the way you actually are you know, your responsibilities. Like limitation clauses. One of the things that I've seen quite commonly, it can say in a contract, and I'm going to digress slightly into reports again, that you won't be responsible for making any comments about the contract, you know, about the state of the engine or whatever it is, in whatever fashion, or the electrics. And then you get in the report a comment on it. Well, if it's in your contract that you're not going to do it, don't comment in the report, because whatever you do, even if it's outside the contract, you may have formed collateral contract in some form or fashion. It's a bit like collateral warranties. If you're at all interested, you can read about them. I haven't mentioned them here, but they can find that you've decided to digress or to modify the contract, and therefore you've decided to go outside the scope of your terms and conditions. And they will then say, particularly, even if somebody's got a massive millions of pounds worth of yachts, they may say, oh no, there was reliance on that. But then the argument will be, well, in my contract, I said, I wasn't going to deal with it. And the judge will say, well, you did deal with it. And therefore they read it and they relied on it. So just make sure if you latent defects, known defects, again, I've seen people caught by somebody saying, well, they knew about that, they were with me. Well, if they're with you and they know about it, write down the defects and write to them immediately and say, when we were there, you notice this, you notice that, etc. You know, at least make it clear back to them even before you do your report. And so you want to exclude known defects. Defects under warranty, I think it's quite good to consider putting something in for this, because a number of times they think the surveyor is an easier call than the warranty document. Okay, so I would say that it's probably consumers, again, consumer law is complicated now, particularly in the UK. You're probably more likely to also get brought into litigation. But it's still worth putting it in nowadays, because I think really it's a good idea, because you don't want to spend your time trying to defend something, because it takes a long while, you know, court cases do. And how much do you want to be liable for to anybody? I mean, that's the question you have to consider. Variable on each contract? Do you need it in your schedule, what I call your schedule bit, or do you want to put it solidly in your terms and conditions, or do you want a section that you can modify your terms and conditions in your schedule, as insurers do? So if you look at your insurance contract, it's very similar, your setup should be in your structuring. So, but there are quite a few more, but it would take quite some time to go through them. So modifying contracts, they can be done unintentionally. And sometimes if it's not quite clear, it can be, which I haven't put down here, I call the battle of the forms. You can find actually that you've managed to modify your terms and conditions just by virtue of emails backwards and forwards. So be careful how you write. And that's why I always think it's quite good to have at the bottom of an automatic signature that goes in your emails that all your work is subject to your terms and conditions. Somebody could argue, oh, well, you know, I don't believe because you tried to modify them. But it's really quite good. And the number of very large firms now that automatically have that on is substantial. So we all click, don't we, to agree stuff. Whoever reads those terms and conditions? Anybody? Anybody admit to reading? Oh, it's when I'm here, under terms and conditions. I click quite often, particularly when I'm booking things. But you're bound. You're bound by them as soon as you click. You know, it is quite good if you've got a sophisticated website, you know, somebody, you know, just get them to click to accept. It is quite good to have a signature section, to have things signed. It's not always necessary to have things signed. Again, it depends how you phrase things. It's better for consumers. Courts don't like consumers not to know. That's why we're supposed to sign everything or click on things. But it doesn't always mean that they're going to completely, not consider the terms and conditions. And particularly sometimes it's impossible to get contracts signed. But at least you could get something back by email saying that they're accepting them. But as long as your contract doesn't say somewhere this has to be signed, okay, because then that sort of null and voids it. Right, insurance contracts. Are we all awake? You know, who's read their insurance contract? Hands up. Wow. Did you understand it? Hands up who understood it. Oh, you did? Oh, well. Okay. Sorry? Excellent. Oh, I like somebody to ask questions. It is actually quite interesting. It means that somebody's actually reading them. And sometimes mistakes are made in insurance contracts and they have never been spotted. Because, you know, they're like any document. We wouldn't need lawyers if we had never had contracts that were incorrect. We wouldn't have a job. So, as I said, don't just rely on insurance. Insurance is, I mean, a number of times I've heard people say, oh, I don't care, I'm insured for that. Well, they obviously haven't read the small print because, as like all contracts, there's exclusions. So insurance forms just a part of controlling what could be a potential loss of business. And at the end of the day, if you can't stand potential for losing, then you shouldn't be in any business, because all businesses have a potential for losing or having a problem. It doesn't matter whether you're in a large company or whether you run your own company. But at the end of the day, there's going to be a risk because of chance of litigation. And so when you actually consider your insurances, here is just a short list of things that you should think about. Business activities during the year, make sure that you tell them. Even if you're not sure if you've changed your business activity, tell them. Okay. Particularly as the insurance market's getting harder, there's going to be fewer insurers as time goes on. When I first started, there was over 300 Lloyd's syndicates. 300 Lloyd's syndicates when I was in my 20s. I don't think there's 30 now. Okay, that just tells you how few insurers they are. A lot of these insurers are now owned by people outside the UK, okay, and they expect a return. And the reason why, as we all know, it goes into investments, and people won't back and they won't buy shares, so they have to see a return. Over the last few years, if you plot it, the actual cost of insurance has dropped and fallen. It hasn't gone the other way around. It's actually fallen, and particularly for professional indemnity. When I first started, I had a 5,000 excess on my company. I've now got a 2,500 excess, and my premiums have gone down, and yet I've got larger and larger. Would you reduce your hourly rate? At the end of the day, eventually the pot is not going to be big enough, and we are getting more and more claims because litigation is easier. So it's an interesting area, and I think with Solvency II as well, the applications, there's going to be fewer and fewer insurers, and that means that when particularly they're responsible to people and they have to make a certain return, they will just pull from the markets, particularly those that are probably backed by Americans in particular that dabble in our country. They would just pull areas almost immediately. And so you can find one moment you've got an area, and next moment is, you haven't got cover available for the next renewal. And always make sure your contracts don't breach anything on your thing. Think about it. Don't waiver anything. If you want to waiver your rights in any way against somebody, make sure you clear it with your insurance company. Okay? And don't give warranties. Don't warrant anything unless you've cleared it with your insurance company that it's going to be covered. A number of times I've seen people form a warranty without using the word warranty. And don't promise anything you can't promise. One thing we're taught right from the beginning as lawyers: never say that you can do something that is under the control of a third party. Okay, never ever say that, because you're binding yourself as an obligation that you cannot control, and you would then be liable for it. So make sure you also know when you have to advise of a claim or potential claim occurrence. I say nowadays, advise them immediately of any grumblings, because the industry is getting such that with the case law, that if you don't, you can find that you're out of time. Normally it's about 60 or 90 days at the end of the year if you're not continuing with the insurer to allow you to actually advise them. But if you don't, you can find you've got no insurance cover. And we've had a couple of people that have come to us where they've actually fallen foul of that, and they've had no insurance cover. So, And again, make sure you consider the amount of loss that could occur. Now, you can never insure up to your maximum potential loss. Not even large companies do. It's just not realistic. But you have to take a reasonable idea, you know, of what the loss could be. But you know, the number of people that deal with multi-million-pound vessels, and they don't have that amount of coverage. So the clauses that you find, these are the normal sort of standard clauses that you will find. Your general definitions and your general conditions and your exclusions. General conditions is where you'll frequently find the claims ones. Read the claims one very carefully. Your cover sections are your insuring clauses, okay, and they should be headed up cover sections. You get policy extensions. Some of them apply, some of them don't apply. Check your schedule. It should be in your schedule. Okay. Warranties, there's fewer now, but some are there. And then you get specific definitions, which really complicates matters, because then you've got to read your normal definitions, then your specific ones in the sections, just to make it easier to understand the policy. Conditions precedents, make sure that you read those carefully. They won't pay out if you breach them if those condition precedents are written correctly. They can't carte blanche now write in the UK following our conditions precedent. They have to make it clear that everyone is, okay? It's because that was something on case law that they won't accept now. So I said the claims condition clauses, particularly the timings. Quite frequently they split the claims condition. It's really irritating, even for me to find them. You'll find one bit in one place, and then you'll find the bit about the 90 days after the perhaps the end of the policy should you not renew in another place, or 60 days. So it's just the way historically they've written them. And make sure you consider retroactive date. Many people say, well, what is this? It's how far back you can be sued, basically. And it will vary. I would say 6 years on runoff, make sure you have it. And for each business activity, don't just remove it. Make sure it's clear that for certain business activities that you're now not stating you want retroactive cover for. So many people miss that. They say, oh, I'm just going to fill the form in for declaration for the annual, you know, quote. And you change it, and then you forget to ask for cover. And some insurers will then say, well, you didn't put it down, you didn't ask for retroactive cover for the work you did prior to the period, and that's their get out clause. So make sure that you confirm to them that you're not doing this now, but you still want cover. Okay, make sure it's quite clear. Do you want insureds or subcontractors when you're dealing with people? Do you want subcontractors whereby there's no recourse against them, so they're not quite insureds, but there's no right of recourse, perhaps because they've got no means of getting insurance? So you need to discuss this with your broker as to what you want. Insured, subcontractors, normal subcontractors which will have their own insurance cover, or subcontractors where you're prepared to cover them and you don't want any right of recourse against them. Okay, and that has to be clear. People get that muddled, so make sure it's quite clear. Your territories, make sure it covers the areas. The biggest problem we have is when it says that, for example, there's no cover for litigation that occurs in the United States, then you're dealing with somebody who's US and they start proceedings in the United States. So make sure you know where you're likely to be sued, and then that person may have no cover. So, and again, make sure you know your policy excess. So insurance, so general tips, I'm to the end now. Contracts have their limits of cover, as with all contracts. Make sure you list your business activities. Keep a list somewhere, separately, on a spreadsheet, and your dates when you started and stopped the activities. And you can send a copy. Keep a spreadsheet, I think that's pretty good on years. And just keep a list of the countries covered, etc. as well. But you can just send them a spreadsheet then. As long as you divulge, even if you don't fill in all of their proposal form, they've got the information. And the important thing, which I haven't mentioned here, is the Insurance Act 2015, which is beneficial for people that insure in the UK. So advise your broker of any changes during the year. That I can't stress that enough. And put it in writing, okay? Put it in writing. Somebody might be working there one day and they're not working the next, okay? So make sure you put it in writing. And read your schedule and policy as one, and I should have put there any endorsements that modify. And when you're dealing with warranties, make sure you understand your warranties quite clearly. as to what you can do and can't do. And particularly if you're doing any form of testing, you might find that you're testing something, but in actual fact, because you're testing, you're going outside of what you would do as your profession. On those ones. Questions? Oh, they've gone to sleep. Oh, we have a few. I don't mind. Did you have that?
We just take a couple of questions because time is really against us now.
Yes.
Thank you very much for the presentation. Under